And before we get started talking about what we're going to talk about today, the boarding school report, I just want to say that we will be including a link to some resources for those who may be experiencing some, triggering episodes about the things that we're going to talk about today, specifically related to the abuse of children, sexual violence, physical, spiritual, and cultural violence against Indigenous children. Um, and there are resources out there. The Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has an excellent list of resources. We'll include it in the podcast notes if those of you who are interested in seeking out resources for yourself or others, or just finding out more about the history of this particular issue. They come highly recommended. We've done interviews with one of the founders of NABS, as it's called, and you can check that out. It's Denise Lajamadir, who wrote a book called Stringing Rosaries, which is actually about a history of Catholic-run boarding schools in the Northern Plains. So you can check that out. We also have some other boarding school episodes, and like this issue is so massive, and this report is so massive in its scope that we probably will be having more episodes to come. So I highly recommend doing your own research, talking to your own family if you can about these things, because there is nobody in Indian country or, as this report points out, in Alaska Natives, as well as Native Hawaiians, who is not touched by this in some way or another. So with that said, I think Jen and I will get started in this boarding school report. This was issued in May 2022, and it came out of the U.S. Department of Interior, which I think everyone should know by now that is the kind of overlord of Indian affairs, and has been since 1849. Prior to that, it was the War Department, something which we will talk about in the context of this episode. But just to put this into like historical context, on June 22nd, in 2021, Deborah Holland, who is from Laguna Pueblo, who's also the acting secretary of Department of Interior, made a commitment to coordinate a massive federal investigation of the federal Indian boarding school system. And they have created a kind of historical or periodization of the boarding school system, which they date between 1819 and 1969. So about 150 years or a century and a half of boarding school policies implemented by the United States. And as the executive report points out, the United States operated or supported about 408 boarding schools across 37 states or then territories, which included like Alaska or Hawaii, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 schools in Hawaii. And this report, if you're interested, actually identifies those schools by name. And in fact, NABS, as I mentioned earlier, has a really useful map at showing where these boarding schools are located, and which tribal communities were affected by them. And so I think it's also important to point out that this report also identifies what we know as day schools, which were operating, in their federally run facilities that were operating on reservations where children would go for the day, so to speak. No like regular kind of normal schooling system, but having gone through some of the archives here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., it's pretty interesting to see the similarities between the policies of the day schools and the boarding schools, especially the way that they attack Indigenous culture, as well as trying to not only reform Indigenous children, but their parents as well, or colonize them, I guess is one way to put it. And just to be clear, this report doesn't say it, but lays out all the evidence for it. And that's the case of genocide. And under international law, I think it's important to point out right away that the taking of, or the forceful transference of children from one group to another is by definition, under international law, under the UN Geneva Conventions that were ratified by the United States not until the 1980s, ironically. But nonetheless, that is the definition of genocide. And so this is what's happening. And in kind of academic circles and advocacy circles, this is something that's called Indian child removal or native child removal, or just child removal in general, because child removal wasn't just a genocidal practice against indigenous peoples in the Americas, but was also practiced against indigenous African people in the African continent, specifically with the transatlantic slave trade. And in fact, this is kind of a little bit tangential, but I think it plays into the kind of guiding ideology of boarding schools themselves. But in fact, that what Saidiya Hartman has called natal alienation, or the stripping of children from their parents and their mother, so to speak, like in terms of their mother language, their mother country, and their mothers themselves, is a form of genocide, and has been effectively used and practiced by slavers in this country, specifically against African people. And so it's not a phenomenon that just targets indigenous people, but it operates for different ways. And so in the context of the kind of elimination or genocidal policies against African people, that was for enforced labor, right? And for indigenous people, it was to take the land specifically. And also this happened to Puerto Rican children as well, and Filipino children as well. So this is a very kind of widespread policy. And Colonel Pratt himself, Richard Pratt, who is considered the architect of the kind of modern off-reservation boarding school system at Carlisle Indian School, which we'll talk about in a bit. He was commanding mixed. He was a Civil War veteran, but he was also commanding mixed units in the Army of the West when he was fighting in the Indian Wars. And by mixed units, I mean that he was commanding, white soldiers alongside of recently liberated African soldiers and black soldiers, as well as Indian scouts. And he writes this in his book, Battlefield and Classroom, which is kind of an ironic name for an autobiography, which really kind of spells out how connected the militarization of Indian country is with the boarding school system itself. But he says that he was influenced by the Americanization, the quote unquote, what he called the Americanization of the Negro, quote unquote. Those are his words, not mine, where he said it was only through the decimation or the attempted annihilation of their, sense of identity, right? And the taking of them from their families, that they could be fully Americanized, like white people themselves. And so he was saying that after, these really kind of bloody wars of conquest in the West, during Reconstruction specifically, post-World War or post-Civil War, everyone was going back to their communities except for the Indian scouts, who were, in effect, an auxiliary of the U.S. military, but were going back to the reservation to go, in his eyes, be Indians and not be civilized and be outside of, the kind of Americanizing project, but also to continue to sort of be impediments to westward expansion. And so his idea, arose specifically by saying, well, the only reason why, black folks were successfully militarized, and the kind of great equalizer of, black, white, and indigenous was the military. So he, in effect, saw this kind of martial citizenship as a way to begin kind of this, what we call the process of assimilation, which is really just genocide against a different kind of genocide against indigenous people. So just really wanted to quickly point that out. And so this report came out in May, and it's a very comprehensive report, and I recommend everyone read it. Take some time to read it. It's really difficult to get through. It was hard for me to get through, and it all kind of came at once, but this report, the kind of executive summary of it, was that it found more than 50 grave sites, and kind of concluded that more grave sites would be found, and had identified at least 500 Native American, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian children had died while attending these schools. And one researcher, whose name is Preston McBride, who's been working with NABS and the International Indian Treaty Council at the United Nations, and kind of doing this research, has come, according to his research, he's estimated that these graves will end up being somewhere around 40,000. So the graves that they identified so far are just kind of a preliminary estimate. And there's also a lot of caution and care around this as well, because just speaking from the experience of something like the Rapid City Indian School in Rapid City, that just this is something that I know about. That boarding school had, I think there were like several grave sites or cemeteries that it had in its existence when children were attending school, and because the land was transferred from transferred from federal trust, Indian trust, into municipal government, i.e., the Rapid City city government. The federal government didn't go out and identify these grave sites, and so there's already been instances of looting and vandalism of some of the grave sites, and so there's a reluctance on behalf of indigenous people and descendants to really identify them, because there's just this long history of grave robbing. So there's multiple factors here, and in fact, this is something that I think it's important to point out, that it affects everyone. And even Secretary Holland, during the press conference and the release of this report, said that her grandparents were both 8 years old when they were forced to attend boarding school. And she said, quote, many children like them never made it back to their homes. Each of those children is a missing family member, a person who was not able to live out their purpose on this earth because they lost their lives as part of this terrible system. Which is it's pretty powerful words, especially coming from the Secretary of Interior. And it is important to point out as well that while Secretary Holland never in her her office never uses the language of genocide, the NABS researchers who were part of this project with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, they did use the word genocide, not in the report itself, but in the press conference. So, and I recommend everyone go and check out the press conference. There's a lot that's said. There was James LaBelle Sr., who is in Inupiaq and is a vice president of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. He said that even though it's ceased or stopped in many places, the vestiges of this is still continuing today. And one of the things that he actually said in that speech as well is that it continues today in the current incarceration of Leonard Peltier. And in fact, Leonard Peltier is a survivor of the boarding school system. And there's, we can include a link to his testimony about surviving boarding school and being taken away. And so he's also, it's part of this kind of carcerality, or the mass incarceration of Native people is part of this kind of eliminatory element of the boarding school system that continues with also attacking political resistance or social resistance in terms of the Red Power movement and the American Indian movement. So that was actually an interesting connection that he made at the start of this. And it's important to say also that basically every school had a cemetery. So if there are over 400 schools, we can estimate that there are hundreds of cemeteries, right? And so this is also just part of a initial report. I think it's the first report of many to come. And the context of of this report, I think, is limited actually in its scope, because it accounts for what it can see in terms of the archives that exist. And as Jen and I have discovered, that archive is very incomplete, and it's not a full picture. And I think there's a tendency to believe that the United States government kind of has this eye of Sauron, this all-seeing eye, where it's like it houses all these secrets. And I think it misses the fact that there was a lot of negligence in play in terms of these boarding schools, because if it was just a, this kind of really, well-oiled machine, it was good at capturing children, no doubt about that. But taking care of them after they were taken is another story, right? And that's what we are finding out here, is because a lot of those children just went missing, and they never returned home. And those who did, suffered the consequences for the rest of their lives. So